I'm Emily Jashinsky.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Josh Hammer.
And I'm Inez Stepman, in for Rachel Bovard.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, again, we have a great show, as you can imagine, as the situation continues to be difficult in Afghanistan, to say the very least. We have a lot to discuss here. That topic will not be the only thing we cover. We are also we're starting with the January 6th charade. Ben is going to start us off with that. I'm actually going to talk about the disgusting parallels some people on the left have made between what happened on January 6th and the Taliban, and that may seem ridiculous, but of course, that's the argument that serious people, late night hosts are making. We're going to talk about a national interest foreign policy, and Josh is going to discuss that. And Inez, off the Afghanistan topic, but onto an important topic, is going to be discussing Biden's loan forgiveness proposal. Inez has a very interesting perspective on this and has recently written an excellent essay on it, so I look forward to that conversation. On that note, Ben, let's kick it over to you.
Yeah, there were a couple big revelations with respect to all things January 6th last week that I want to focus on during this segment, and to sort of segue us or transition us from all things Afghanistan last week to where we are now. It strikes me that we commenced a quote unquote global war on terror and sent soldiers overseas to fight and die, originally to take on the jihadists, and then for all manner of other goals, constantly shifting, which we'll probably talk about a little bit in this show, that ultimately I've argued ended up undermining our national interest. And now, 20 years onward, we've entered what I've termed a domestic war on wrongthink, in which, among others, former military men and women are being targeted as the potential domestic extremists. So it's remarkable to look at this arc of history from basically September 12th, 2001 to today, and how ultimately those who went and fought and in some cases died overseas, now their comrades in arms are in some cases being targeted here in this war on wrongthink. And so January 6th, I've argued, has been used as the central data point that those who believe that there's a scourge of domestic violent extremism rooted in white supremacy, which is used as a stand-in for essentially anything that is non-progressive here, going back to the progressive or bigot binary that we speak to often on this show. And secondly, that if January 6th is the central point on which the scaffolding has been built to justify this entire massive domestic war on terror, on violent extremism, so-called, and that narrative collapses, then everything around that narrative ought to collapse as well. And we've talked in the past about the fact that, well, this really was not a murderous armed insurrection where the Republic hung in the balance. And actually, according to leaks out of the FBI last week, we found out that they themselves have found that, and there have been around 40 people who are facing some sort of conspiracy charges, maybe slightly more in connection with January 6th, out of around 600 people so far who have been hit with charges. FBI has reported essentially to Reuters that it appears that there was no coordinated planned plot to essentially try to halt the peaceful transfer of power, so to speak, that this was not some massive conspiracy that aimed to undermine the Republic and halt the transition of power. So that's a major, major blow to those who call this an insurrection aimed at taking down the country. And then another point, separate and apart, but related, I've also long argued that it appears, given the incredibly lengthy pretrial detentions that many have been subjected to for months on end, oftentimes without it being presented with counter evidence from the government, which is still sitting on thousands of hours worth of footage, some of which may be exculpatory, and other evidence as well. Many of these individuals are stuck. Sometimes it appears in solitary confinement for 23 hours, or at least in their cells for 23 hours a day. There have been reports of beatings and other awful conditions to which many non-hardened criminals with no past records have been subjected. One of these individuals, it turns out, recently released from pretrial detention after agreeing to a plea deal, actually served more time in pretrial detention than the maximum sentencing guidelines for the one charge to which he had pled guilty. This, to me, perfectly demonstrates, this is the perfect data point, which would indicate that really the process is the punishment in many cases, and that this is actually aimed, this whole prosecution, as potentially trying to chill anyone who would dare dissent from the narrative, I'd put that in quotes, about everything that transpired during the 2020 election, because the judges themselves and the prosecutors themselves have in many instances said those being jailed ought not to be let go because they hold dangerous ideas around the 2020 election. Dangerous, I put that in scare quotes again. So with all of that background, I guess my question would be, given what has happened to the narrative about this being a murderous armed insurrection and the like, and a coordinated plot to undermine democracy from evil MAGA, what happens to the extent that even those who have the greatest incentive to try to prove that case are showing that actually they can't prove sedition or some massive conspiracy or the like, and this does appear to be the pathetic effort that we all saw it to be? Where do we go from here? Did those in power double down essentially on the attack on deplorables, or are they going to have to shift in their tactics to pursue wrong thinkers?
I mean, I guess I'll kick it off here. I mean, it seems to me that they'll just find some other way, or they'll find some other hook to kind of double this down, right? I mean, when one narrative collapses, the vacuum, the void will be filled by something else. I just want to make a quick note here. I mean, this is a point I've made on previous podcasts here. Inez and I are both lawyers by training. Insurrection is like a legal term. This is like a centuries old term with like a very, very, very old history in like Anglo-American law. So I was just quickly Googling. So not to go like full lawyer here, but like Black's Law Dictionary is like a technical like legal dictionary that like lawyers use. Here's how insurrection is defined on Black's Law Dictionary. Quote, a rebellion or rising of citizens or subjects in resistance to their government. Insurrection shall consist in any combined resistance to the lawful authority of the state with intent to the denial thereof when the same is manifested or intended to be manifested by acts of violence. So difficult to obviously apply that to what Ben accurately describes as the pathetic acts of maybe 150, 200, 250, whatever people here. This was not a society-wide insurrection. It was always facially absurd. It was patently false. And that's not to say, obviously, that we should apologize on behalf of the 250 people, obviously, who went in there. No one on the show has ever done that, nor would we. But the narrative that this is the deplorables literally rising up in arms to take down the United States government was always a ridiculous notion. Julie Kelly, American Greatness, has done yeoman's work in kind of exposing how this narrative was false from day one. And I, for one, am very happy that it continues to be shown as false. But I guess to more narrowly answer your question, Ben, here, this war on wrongthink is only going to continue. That's not going to slow down anytime soon here. And kind of, look, the entire kind of ruling class apparatus here, okay, both inside and outside the government, obviously, Biden administration working closely hand in hand with Facebook and the other big tech oligarchs to try and censor kind of quote unquote disinformation with respect to the COVID vaccine and everything. All of this stuff is going to just continue. It's not going to get any better here. It's like a slightly kind of black pillish take, I guess. Whether the hook for doing so is January 6th or they just happen to stumble upon a new hook, I think that's to be determined, but I guess increasing looks like probably the latter.
Sure. And I'm really curious to get Emily's take on this because she was actually there for part of it, covering the protest, and then ultimately watching it devolve into a riot before she got out, fortunately. But look, at the beginning, I had a big fight with people about this. Calling it a coup or an insurrection is ridiculous, and it gives way too much credit to a bunch of guys with like some zip ties. It was not. It was very clearly not organized, and I wrote about at the time how it's the aesthetics of it, both in terms of the riots that took place, BLM and with Antifa throughout last summer, and with regard to January 6th, the aesthetics of it are very, very difficult to take seriously. It almost feels like we're LARPing, right? Like there is literally a guy with horns on wandering around the U.S. Capitol, right? I do think that it helps us distance ourselves from it. I don't know at what point these kinds of things will really become like quote unquote serious. What's serious is the response, as Ben brought up and Josh brought up, the response to it in terms of first, of course, social media censorship and censorship in favor of quote unquote, as you called it, the narrative. And then now these very disturbing reports that in fact the justice system is not being applied equally under the law. And certainly we knew that most of the people who rioted all throughout 2020, very few of them have been prosecuted. So that was unfair to begin with. Of course, being a law and order conservative, I would like to see everybody who rioted prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But it's a real problem when people, again, if the theme is losing faith in institutions, when people, I mean, this is a really good reason to lose faith with the justice system. If you see that people are being punished differently, not according to the severity of their crimes, but because their political views are favored or disfavored, like that's a very, very serious tentative faith to lose. And I think, again, it can only have negative consequences, which will hopefully at some point lead us to take all of this seriously, the politicization of the justice system seriously, and start to actually rebuild some of these institutions that are necessary for a stable and free society.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the things that I noticed, so one of the most interesting things about the report is that it says, you know, the vast majority, I think it says like 95% of these people were just sort of caught up in the moment where you have, but then you do have, crucially, 5% of people who were like were planning to make trouble. And that's why that speaks to how ridiculous the entire conversation in the press and on the left has been about this, and that you have 5% there where you have a serious problem, right? You have like 5% of people who show up who are trying to cause trouble, and this completely reflects the reality of what I saw when I was there covering it, where you had this just the most unlikely rioters in terms of like middle-aged, like soccer moms. People that you wouldn't think would ever storm anything except for like a Black Friday sale, just rushing the Capitol. And it was people getting caught up in a moment. And I think a lot of that had been ginned up for sure by, like, the Wall Street Journal had an amazing report on some people who had never gone to the speech and who had just gone to the Capitol. And I think it was like Proud Boys members who were planning to be at that Capitol. And there were people that definitely had poor motivations, that were planning to cause problems. And then it just sort of became easier for the crowd to get swept up in it. And the important point here is that we can't deal effectively with the small number of people who are genuinely planning trouble when we are describing everybody as that. If you're going to use these labels to include every single person that made the mistake of getting caught up in the moment, and some of them, by the way, didn't think they were storming anything. They thought the doors were just opened and they were roaming around the Capitol. It was a big situation. What we saw in one place was not reflective of what you saw in another place. And so when you're lumping everybody in together, calling them a deadly insurrectionist, terrorists, and this is how we can segue right into the next topic, you aren't going to deal with you're glossing over the characteristics of that small group of people who actually need to be dealt with. And it's so counterproductive, and that speaks to a problem, I think, more broadly in our politics with the definition inflation that the left saddles our discourse with. It's so counterproductive. Are there 5% of people who are out there to make trouble, and that security and law enforcement should be paying close attention to at events like this? Yeah, absolutely. But you're telling them they need to pay attention to 100% of the people. And it's an important distinction. So on that note, speaking of the distinction, let's talk about how some absurd comparisons were made over the course of the last week or so about the January 6th rioters and the Taliban. Again, it sounds crazy, but this is a point that was made by people with massive platforms who are taken very seriously. Stephen Colbert said, why would we be fighting the radicals perpetuating a civil war in their own country when we have that happening in our capital? It's outrageous. It defies logic. It almost defies argumentation because it's so absurd to compare what happened on January 6th to the Taliban. Michael Moore made a similar comparison. And again, I don't really consider Michael Moore a serious person, but he does have a big platform. Stephen Colbert has a huge platform. And it's pretty remarkable to see. Raw Story actually collected a lot of tweets from the left that, and I hate these articles that like compile tweets and act as though they're representative of anything. But this particular collection is a lot of tweets. You can see a lot of people making this comparison between January 6 rioters and the Taliban. And it just speaks to something so wrong in the United States of America that somebody could have the thought and then publish the thought, whether it's on their own personal Twitter or on their late night show or on their platform like Michael Moore has, so that you have the thought and then you think it's smart enough and important enough to publish. It seems remarkable to me that we're seeing sort of our own countrymen as the Taliban. That's not to say there aren't radicals in the United States. Of course there are radicals in the United States, but to juxtapose pictures of the Taliban in the palace in Afghanistan with January 6th, people in our capital, again, it almost defies counter argumentation because it's so silly, but I'll open up to the group and see what my question is. What is the importance of these comparisons being made? What is the relevance? What should we take away from the fact that these comparisons are actually being floated?
Well, I'll jump in and make a couple points here. I don't think that this is merely hyperbole or just a demonstration of the animus that our ruling class has for the people they seek to rule over, those pesky, up to 70 million plus people who defied them by not voting against the avatar of the ruling class in the last election and beyond as well. I don't think it's just hyperbole or reckless or deplorable rhetoric, but I think that there are actually tangible policy consequences and that this creates the information space for those policies to be proffered as serious. So I'll go back to my hobby horse here, which is the Biden administration's plan for countering domestic terrorism, of course, is rooted in a view of turning those global war on terror powers against those who constitute the preeminent threat the administration and the national security apparatus claims exist here, that element of white rage in this country, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has devoted himself to, while the Middle East devolves. It's very clear that they take this view to heart, that some percentage of their fellow countrymen do constitute the Taliban of America, and consequently, they need to use the full force of the federal government and a whole of government effort to pursue them, of course, in tandem with big tech and all manner of other corporate ruling class auxiliaries as well. So I think that this shouldn't be just dismissed as essentially the Stephen Colberts and Michael Moores of the world exposing their views of their fellow countrymen like this. I think there are real consequences. And if you look back, there are any number of clips around January 6th of individuals who are former high-ranking FBI or DOJ officials, military officials, and the like, talking about the fact that we might need a counterinsurgency kind of model here to deal with the domestic violent extremist elements, of course, which they sort of conflate with conservative thought or non-progressive thought in this country. So I think there are real consequences. And by the way, it's worth noting when we talk about the 5% of radicals, let's say, that was the 5% of the 600 plus people that have been charged, not the thousands of people, most of whom were there very peacefully in Washington that day. So it's a percentage of a percentage of a percentage being used to smear tens of millions of Americans and justify a wholly un-American effort to purge them from American life.
Let's make a quick comparison here just to kind of pinpoint just how wildly out of touch, ahistorical, and frankly just hysterical this sort of rhetoric is. So to kind of weave together the first segment and this current one, do you know what was like an actual, like a real insurrection? The Civil War. Okay, President Lincoln, the Lincoln administration, of course, never recognized the Confederacy. They treated the Southern Rebellion as a domestic insurrection. So let's compare kind of what Emily's talking about here, these ridiculous tweets, David Rothkopf, this horrific tweet comparing Trumpers, deplorables, whatever, to the Taliban. Let's compare that to President Lincoln's second inaugural address, which is just a beautiful, beautiful speech. We've read it on this program before. I'm going to do that again. I'm just going to read the final paragraph of Lincoln's second inaugural address. This is March 1865, about a month before the Civil War ends. A real insurrection, brothers fighting against brothers, 600,000 plus Americans dead. Okay. President Lincoln says, quote, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Is it possible to have like a more radically different conception of kind of national unity and not going to these great extremes of tarring our brothers? This was a civil war, okay? 600,000+ Americans died. And President Lincoln there is talking about how with malice for none, with charity for all, and compare that to what we're hearing now from Emily's. The juxtaposition could not be starker. And it's really just wild, right? Because the American left in so many ways likes to obviously kind of preach, take a moral high ground and preach, plume itself and say that it is always better, that it's this Whig theory of history that Obama always talked about, how the arc of history bends towards justice, blah, 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 blah. But nothing could be more unjust than the rhetoric that they are doing. And I think it's kind of very neat if you can kind of just do a little side-by-side comparison there with what President Lincoln spoke about. So I just want to make that quick point in as well.
Yeah, if you bring up Lincoln, of course, who famously played Dixie on the lawn very shortly after the South surrendered, right at Appomattox. I think the one of the many things that was laudable about President Lincoln was how much thought he gave to what would happen after the Civil War, right? How to seem a country that literally was brother killing brother back together as one nation. And meanwhile, it really seems that even forgetting for a moment about January 6th, about, domestic insurrection and the language here and comparing people to the Taliban, there is no plan on the left to live with the 75 million people as fellow citizens who fundamentally disagree with them, right? Who voted for Trump either in 2016, 2020. There's no actual plan to actually live as citizens alongside. And perhaps that is because we are, I think, ideologically or fundamentally more divided than we have been since the 1850s, where we disagree on fundamental questions of citizenship, of virtue. And I mean, I was actually talking to a liberal friend a while back, and I asked him a really simple question. What do you think the left and the right, what could you get 80% agreement on that isn't so high level as to be completely meaningless, right? You can't say liberty if you have two completely different definitions of liberty. What, sort of not granular policy statement, but what even mid-level political principle do you think that right and left could come together on in this country? What could you get 80% support for? And he really couldn't come up with anything, and neither could I. I know that people are always whining about polarization when they talk about partisanship and gridlock, which is frankly how our government is supposed to work largely. And most of the time I've dismissed that whining as basically we're polarized because occasionally the politicians actually reflect the polarization of the people. But this level of polarization, I don't think we've seen since before the Civil War in the 1850s. And it's on similarly fundamental questions of the polity. And it seems like nobody, to all of your points, nobody is taking the seriousness of that seriously. I don't know how else to end that statement, but nobody is taking that polarization or treating that polarization with the seriousness that it deserves, the seriousness that Lincoln treated it with. So I'm glad you brought up that comparison, Josh, because I think it's very relevant.
And speaking of Josh, can you tell us, Josh, about this rolling conversation on what a conservative foreign policy that serves the national interest should actually look like?
Sure. Yeah. So from my perspective, this is kind of the big conversation going on right now. The immediate kind of short-term conversation is on this horrifically botched withdrawal. We did a whole episode on that last week. Obviously, it's been botched in every way imaginable. And from my perspective, really no need to kind of spend any more time on that. Just go back to our podcast literally from last week. The broader kind of 35,000 foot altitude conversation that is now unfolding is what, I guess, theoretically, if any lessons to take away from what has transpired over 20 lost years in Afghanistan here. And, look, what is a conservative foreign policy? This is obviously a very kind of long running question here. Kind of like the old right, kind of like the pre-New Deal kind of Taft era right, I think had kind of like a lot of more truly isolationist tendencies. The history books, I think, would tell you that Calvin Coolidge in the 1920s was a quote unquote isolationist president. The historians will quibble on that a little bit. True, certainly to an extent. But kind of in like the modern kind of, post-National Review founding kind of a Cold War era, right, national security hawkishness of one strand or another has certainly come, I think, to kind of predominate, at least kind of in kind of the intelligentsia kind of think tank circuit of thought. This kind of obviously reached its apex during the Bush administration. Ironically, of course, if we kind of go back and look back at the 2000 Republican presidential primary, George W. Bush actually kind of ran as kind of like a humble nation, kind of bring the troops home Republican, in contrast to John McCain, who was kind of like the quintessential neoconservative running in that primary at the time. But in any event, post 2000, post 2001 specifically, I guess, kind of, there's in a lot of circles, it's been kind of like this false dichotomy painted that if you don't kind of toe kind of, Bush, Bill Kristol, Dick Cheney, Don Rumsfeld-esque neoconservatism, then you are kind of ipso facto kind of a 1920s style isolationist. From my perspective, and I think a lot of kind of like my friends and allies' perspective, but probably others on this show, I'm sure, this is very much a false dichotomy here. You can be kind of a prudential, realist, kind of national interest focused foreign policy, even a hawk, honestly. I mean, I would self-describe as a hawk. I have instinctual hawkish instincts vis-a-vis America's major national security threats here. But you can have those instincts here. And you can also at the same time eschew and say that these moralistic kind of nation building boondoggles in third world kind of, Islamist Sharia governed tribal backwaters like Afghanistan halfway around the world ultimately redound against the national interest. Because if you actually care about securing America's national interest here, okay, it's very important to recognize that we need to kind of maintain a strong deterrence posture vis-a-vis our core strategic threats. In the year 2021, that's China, that's Russia, that's the Iranian regime, perhaps North Korea, maybe a handful of others, of course. But if you actually care about maintaining that deterrence posture, it is very difficult to do so if you spread yourselves so thin and you suffer these inevitable humiliating defeats like we've just done with the Taliban. Because the reality is that, George W. Bush, I quoted Bush's second inaugural address in my column last week. I don't remember the exact quote, but something along the lines of how like the human soul everywhere kind of yearns for freedom here. That is just total nonsense. That is just total kind of, it's like a true distillation of like a certain conception of Enlightenment liberalism, I think, taken to its logical conclusion. But if you take that and you try to take that to the exporting democracy level here, we have now seen over and over again, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, any other places, that it simply doesn't work. And not only does it not work, but the inevitable humiliating defeats, the withdrawals, what we've now seen on television for the past 2 weeks, hurts us in the national. It hurts us as far as our actual strategic threats are concerned. Look what China has done in Afghanistan here. We are humiliating Afghanistan. China is going to swoop right in here. It would be far better to maintain like a more limited kind of pinpick strike sort of posture here along the lines of kind of the Qasem Soleimani assassinations, Anwar al-Awlaki, from my perspective, these are all fine and kosher. And the best, the Trump administration, I think, in a lot of ways intuited this. It was not perfect, but we can kind of look what the Trump administration did, especially in the Middle East, I think, and Abraham Accords are kind of a shining example of what like a national interest oriented foreign policy would look like. So focusing just real quick on the Middle East is just like one example of like what I have in mind here. I'm going to throw it open to the panel. What the Trump administration did was they basically said, look, for decades, kind of, let's focus on the Abraham Accords and kind of the Israeli-Palestinian issue. For many decades, okay, neoconservatives, neoliberals, nation builders of all stripes, basically said that there is an imperative to form a Palestinian state. And it was kind of this inside-out approach, right? Again, this was not just kind of a John Kerry thing. Neoconservatives on the right very much said this for decades as well. And unless you kind of get the Palestinians a state, then there will not be rapprochement between Israel and kind of the Sunni Arab states. The Trump administration basically said, we are not going to do this kind of moralistic nation building. We're not going to try to carve out a Palestinian state between the river and the sea. And we're just going to buttress and bolster Israel at every possibility. And what was the result of that? The result of that, the result of kind of kicking aside this nation building crusade and focusing on just bolstering a core ally was massive peace. It was like the greatest peace in 25 years, 30 years, in the form of the Abraham Accords with the UAE, Bahrain, and so forth, allying with Israel, and then coming together to oppose Iran like a true, genuine threat. And they did that again by kind of shelving to the back burner these moralistic nation building crusades and focusing on a very narrow national interest, bolster our allies, defeat our enemies kind of conception of foreign policy. So there's a lot to be said on this. I guess my question to the group would be, how do we kind of continue to kind of make this case that this kind of moralistic nation building neoconservatism on the one hand and like true, Ron Paul style isolationism on the other hand really is a false dichotomy? And what do we need to do to kind of advance the ball forward to kind of make the case for this prudential, America first, national interest, whatever you want to call it, middle ground foreign policy approach?
Well, I've written ad nauseum about these different issues and called for sort of a Kirkpatrickian or Churchillian sort of national security and foreign policy. And I think you hit the nail on the head, Josh, when you talk about, first of all, obviously, yes, false choice between interventionism, which means, of course, then occupation and trying to turn Afghanistan's into Switzerland, versus isolationism, i.e. don't have a military essentially, or these kind of extreme hackneyed sort of descriptions of what the two poles are of this argument. The real question is, does it benefit our peace and prosperity or not, these policies? And so there are times when that requires using military force or potentially something beyond military force, but you can easily ultimately completely undermine your national interest and your security and your safety if it becomes, let's use our military force to then try to rebuild countries and essentially become social workers in military garb and engage in kind of like woke social engineering, so to speak, at least comparable to the kinds of societies that we're trying to turn into Switzerland's or woke America's now. So if I was trying to think of a bumper sticker way to describe what I think the right national security and foreign policy ought to be to further those interests of peace and prosperity, it'd be something like this: peace through overwhelming strength, used sparingly, swiftly, and prudently. And maybe that's even a little bit too wordy, but that is rooted in a fundamental view of human nature that implies it. And that view of human nature is, or at least the way we ought to think about it is, this is a world where we're all mixtures of good and evil, but oftentimes the vast majority of the world is covered in darkness, tyranny, and threats, which ultimately want to blot out the beacon of light that America is as an exceptional nation, exceptional in its values and principles and history and people, and then also exceptional in the way of, there hasn't really been an experiment like this in the history of mankind, with few exceptions, and certainly that has lasted for this long. So you have to know yourself and you have to know your adversaries. And in almost every single instance where we go wrong, we don't know ourselves. We have no concept of even what we're defending and why we're defending it. And then clearly we don't know our enemies, because if you knew your enemies, you would apply certain goals, tactics, and strategies tailored to who those adversaries are. And I'm talking in a very abstract light here, but you see it perfectly in the way of Afghanistan, where we clearly didn't know what we were defending or why we were defending it, but we definitely didn't know who the adversary was. And if you don't know who your adversary is, of course, your goals, tactics, and strategies are going to be all off, and you're going to have an ever-changing mission. And consequently, that's ultimately going to serve to diminish our peace and prosperity. So I'd say wokeness at home undermines our national security ultimately, because how can you defend a country if you loathe the country in the first place? And then, of course, the idea of nation building in places completely inhospitable to what we consider to be the ideal model, first of all, goes against human nature. Second of all, it ends up wasting our blood and treasure. It demoralizes us. It diverts us from higher and better uses of these resources, including at home. And then, of course, it allows our worst adversaries to exploit those boondoggles and also strengthen themselves at the same time. So what is a national interest-oriented policy? It's not isolationist or interventionist. It's realistic in the way of understanding human nature, understanding history, knowing ourselves, knowing our adversaries, and responding accordingly.
I think you're right, Ben, to talk about human nature or view of human nature here. It's no secret I'm not like a foreign policy expert in any capacity, but I do think it's utopian, right? As you said, most of the history of the human species has been tyrannical. It has not respected the liberties that until recently we took for granted in the United States. And so the project of remaking the world, even for a country as powerful as the United States, is a quixotic one. And it's especially, I think, out of keeping with our particular nature. America and Americans are not very good imperialists, right? Perhaps that's because of our colonial past, because we have deeply conflicted feelings about being an empire, which we undoubtedly are at this point. At least we are. We are. I don't know how much longer we will be, but we have deeply conflicted feelings about being an empire, and now there's the additional. So I used to consider myself sort of an unabashed American imperialist. I'm a big fan of the Pax Americana argument of the fact that the American order between 1945 and let's say 2016 was very good, not only for America but for the world. You had for the first time really a power that was not particularly interested in essentially sucking up blood and treasure from other countries. A non-imperialist power holding, for example, the Peace of the Seas, which the British Empire did before us, and various other important sort of global stability aspects. But we are not good imperialists, and this was essentially an imperialist project. It was an imperialist project first for Madisonian democracy under Bush, which at least you can say is our own sort of history, our own version of imperialism, which, I think Madisonian democracy is great, but you can't transplant it, easily into a completely foreign culture with no history or development. But now that American imperial project is turning into wokeness, right? Running up the LGBT flag in our embassy in Kabul, right? So like, as a conservative, now I'm even more against that project, because it increasingly, and this is how even, a lot of people in the world are starting to view us, that their American power is synonymous with this sort of leftist woke project. And that's only going to make us more unpopular and our efforts more unsuccessful, I think, in terms of American imperialism.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say that if you don't like America, it makes your foreign policy outlook a very different calculation. And that, I think, is something that we see increasingly, obviously, on the left. I think there's some people on the right that are struggling with it too, that simply don't like, as Tom Nichols said recently, the public. The public, oh my goodness, the public. So I think, this is, we have to rethink the entire project, because we're rethinking the project that involves our own people, and as Tom Nichols would say, the public itself. We're rethinking what it means to be a power here at home, the values of whatever it is we're trying to export. I think there are a lot of people on the right who know this who have a very clear and coherent vision of what it is that we're trying to do, that America is a good and not an evil, but and have, for sort of foundational principles about what that means. But I think the majority of people, to them, that's less clear now than it used to be when we embarked on some of these projects and some of these exploits. And this is just going to make things more coherent and I think more wasteful. So on that note, I will kick it back over to Inez.
Sure. So I'm going to talk about loan forgiveness, which seems like a distraction given the important issues that we have been discussing about our place in the world. But I really don't think it is. And for this reason, my thesis on loan forgiveness, which recently Biden so not only extended the pandemic pause on student loan payments, but actually forgave some $5.86 billion in student loan debt for disabled Americans, which is obviously a toe in the water for larger executive loan forgiveness. And the reason I think this is important is it's actually the lifeblood. Both the student loan programs and the forgiveness on the back end is the lifeblood for two sort of institutions in American life that I think are very, very pernicious. One, of course, being the academy, the universities, many of which could not survive without this loan and then forgiveness programs on the back end. They are not financially solvent without those programs. So we are all paying for universities to train people who hate America, to Emily's point. And But the second piece of this is that loan forgiveness itself is very much a sort of grift or a handout to what Michael Lind or Burnham called the managerial elite. So the people who overwhelmingly benefit from loan forgiveness are not working class Americans. In fact, there are people from the lower half of the income spectrum make up a smaller percentage of students studying on campus and universities today than they did in 1970 when these loan programs were initiated ostensibly for their benefit, right? LBJ initiated these programs under the Great Society in order to provide a avenue for bright, industrious young people to go to university if their families did not have the funds to send them. Instead, what we've seen is it has greatly benefited the children of the upper middle class primarily. And now in our economy, that means the managerial elite. It means the people who staff NGOs, who staff government agencies, who staff, Nike HR, right? Those are the folks. It's not the 1%, right? It's not the multimillionaires and the billionaires who are benefiting from loans or loan forgiveness. They're paying cash, right? But overwhelmingly, it's the children of the managerial elite and then eventually the new managerial elite. And what we're seeing is that university having a bachelor's degree and then ultimately a master's and higher degrees is becoming a hard credentialing barrier. And it's making life in terms of like success. So we're seeing massive disparities in the numbers of people, the outcomes of people without degrees and with degrees. And everybody who is serious about this knows that it's not because you are magically transformed in the 4 years in which you attend a university. It's because that credentialing barrier is becoming harder and harder. So now working class families and middle class families are faced with a very unpleasant choice, which would seem very familiar to us as millennials, which is either you go to university and you take out ever increasing student loans because those loans bolster the tuition price, right? So that's now not a theory. It's proven in multiple studies. Every dollar of federal loan money that appears, a university increases its tuition price by 60 cents. So it's the cause of the massive inflation of tuition. Whereas, in 1983, the loan you were taking out was very manageable. Now the loan is not manageable, and you're taking out that loan to get the exact same job and the exact same income that your father did not have to take out a loan to get. And that has all kinds of downstream effects. It's very, very, like deleterious to the prospects of the working and middle classes in America, who either have to take out these massive loans now and with very little hope of paying them back, or they have to forego the degree. But those same jobs that would have been open to them without the degree 10, 15 years ago just are not open. They all say bachelor's preferred at the bottom because we're creating an oversupply of credentialed people who aren't actually any more educated, certainly not wiser than they were before they went to college. So this is really a grift for a particular aspect of our managerial ruling class. And to me, this forgiveness, and I'll open it up to the rest of you to discuss this, but this forgiveness plan and the way it's being pushed really hard, both by the Biden administration, which has been a little reluctant on some of this, but also by, ostensible warriors for the people, right? Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. At last count, full loan forgiveness would shovel 7 times the amount of money to the top quintile than to the bottom quintile, because that bottom quintile isn't getting college degrees and it's making life much harder. So I guess I'll throw it out to you on that point. The question would be, essentially, how do we reframe this issue? Because I think the left has had enormous success framing it as a working class issue. And the numbers say that it just isn't. It's a handout to the elite.
So one thing that I always think about when this issue comes up here, there are all sorts of loans, right? There are many types of loans that people in America can take out here. Why don't we just start like compiling data and showing that? I don't know. What about like credit card forgiveness, auto loans? There's any number of kind of financial instruments if we're going to get in the business of kind of mass forgiving of the populace. Why in the world would we start with loan forgivenesses for the cross-subsidization of what I think you, Inez, if I'm not mistaken, I think you have aptly dubbed the madrasas of wokeness, which of course is higher education in America. We are literally kind of now with this loan forgiveness apparatus here. Conservatives should not just oppose this; they should vehemently oppose this. We are literally not just talking about cross-subsidizing the children of the professional managerial class of the gentry liberal elite. We are also talking about kind of just literally just giving the rope to further hang ourselves here. Inez is kind of an education policy expert. I defer to her on this, but look, there's been a lot of kind of intellectual energy in kind of like the Orrin Cassidy American Compass circles. Tom Cotton had like a recent bill, I think, if I recall correctly, kind of effectively kind of just like taxing the Harvard endowments of the world and then kind of using that to kind of fund like more apprenticeship programs. These are the sort of kind of public policy ideas that conservatives should kind of get their minds around here. We should, Arthur Millick had that great national affairs essay a year and a half ago, preventing suicide by higher education here. Anything and everything that we can do to prevent the further metastasis of these madrasas of wokeness, we should rally behind. But as kind of a matter of political rhetoric, and kind of forward-facing tactics here, I think one way to do that, and one way to kind of simultaneously then try to show some kind of empathy as well, would at least at a bare minimum kind of provide kind of the data statistics to kind of do like a little side-by-side comparison, showing who would actually benefit from, let's say, college loan forgiveness, and compare that to, I don't know, like auto loan forgiveness, or just various loans out there, because surely the latter will actually redound to blue collar interests much more than the former.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, the left is not prepared to deal with the reality of academia and the sort of, so I actually remember growing up in sort of suburban Milwaukee, and I guess it probably wasn't really considered a suburb, but everything was geared towards college. And it's remarkable just to sort of think back on that, 15 years ago, how every single thing that you did from kindergarten until high school was explicitly about preparing you for college at this very normal public school district in Wisconsin. Everything was college. And the implication is that, of course, you're a failure if you don't go to college. And whether or not they say that, it's clearly implied when every single thing in your academic experience is directed towards a college education. And that's what the left is not prepared to deal with. They're not prepared to deal with the reality of how big government has created a huge increase in the cost of tuition, how wokeness has created a huge increase in the cost of tuition by creating the need for these schools to have wild bureaucracies. And to the extent that there's a democratic establishment that is now sort of increasingly weary of wokeness, they're not prepared to deal with the fact that academia created that in the workforce. So the left sort of position on academia, it's just a muddle right now, and they're not really willing to accept that what they've done is has been ultimately to the detriment of working people. And this entire dynamic, I think, speaks to that, their inability to really talk coherently about what would happen if we just implemented blanket student loan forgiveness. It is absolutely true that a lot of working people would benefit from it, but it's not in the levels that they think. It's not at the, as Inez points out, the math doesn't work out quite as they think it does, and that I think speaks to their own ill preparedness to actually address working people, to know the sort of characteristics and the contours of that demographic, and then to like genuinely understand it. I bet you there are a whole lot of working people who would be furious if they did actually pay their own bills. And this is sort of something that people forget, that there's a basic question of fairness that is really upsetting to a lot of people across the socioeconomic divide. And so that's another aspect of all of this that nobody's really prepared to talk about on the left.
Well, I don't have a lot to add. I think the comparative analyses that have been discussed here are certainly interesting in terms of debating the merits of the issue. But I also think we have to look at what is this at the end of the day really about? And I would suggest that it's a cynical attempted vote buying scheme, and who the real beneficiaries are, of course, ultimately diverge from the stated beneficiaries, because this is, after all, a government plan that we're talking about. This is also a perfect example of government has intervened to blow the massive bubble that exists in the academic world. And it's aided, of course, by the ideology of wokeism, where you have these bloated staffs of administrators covering diversity, equity, inclusion, and infinite other things that have nothing to do with really teaching people how to think and become ultimately productive people in the world. So in every single dimension of this, we're talking about the blowing of an unsustainable and ultimately disastrous bubble for the country. And then what does the government do to deal with a problem that it created? Well, it tries to intervene by creating further problems, which not only have these economic impacts and winners and losers, but then also have ramifications for the sanctity of contracts and private property rights and a whole host of other slew of potentially very pernicious knock-on effects. So I think all around, it's a disaster, but it is worth noting kind of, I always get to sort of what are the stakes, what is really driving this sort of policy, and then what are the long-term ramifications? And I think in this case, all of them look pretty negative.
Well, on that note, we can go around the room and transition to our final thoughts. Who wants to kick us off?
I'll kick us off because my final thoughts are related to what we just talked about. So, and then we can move on from the topic of loans, but I'm going to broaden it from loans to the meritocracy. The ruling class now, they're even internal, you see that their external legitimacy is collapsing, but internal legitimacy is based on the idea that it is a meritocracy. And that those most credentialed, most educated among us, quote unquote, educated, deserve to make the decisions for the society because they are a meritocratic elite. And what the numbers on student loans and on universities more generally show is that that is not true. That in fact, the function that university degrees are serving in our economy is the perpetuation of class. It's a credentialing class exercise. And in addition to the statistics about, being fewer and fewer, working and middle class students on campus, I'll give you this gut punch statistic, which literally put my jaw on the floor when I first read it. You are more likely to graduate with a 4-year degree if you have income in the top half of the United States spectrum, but math scores in the bottom half, than you are if you have math scores in the top half and income in the bottom half. That's not a meritocracy. And that illusion of meritocracy is what is perpetuating the power of this class of people, to relate it to all the other things we talked about, the people who then go on to become the foreign policy credentialed blob, for example. We aren't actually promoting our best and brightest from all different backgrounds into the American elite. What we have now is a self-perpetuating elite that uses college credentialism as an economic barrier to keep themselves and their children, oftentimes undeservedly, in power, and to keep that kind of power within an isolated managerial class. And I think that's not only a flagrant sort of abuse of the American dream, but it is the upstream root of a lot of the other problems that we have throughout our different institutions, where it seems not only are our elite woke, they're not elite because it's not a real meritocracy.
I was gonna say, this is about absolutely everything. I mean, this is the root of everything. We have lost our consensus on what it is, what the good is. And this speaks to that, and our muddled foreign policy speaks to that. It comes to everything. I mean, the reason that we push so many people through this perpetuation of rigid class divides that don't serve people is because we've lost our concept of what a good life looks like. What does the good life look like? Is a prerequisite for the good life in 2021 that you come out of Oberlin with fluency in Judith Butler? No, it really isn't. And to sort of insist that that's a path that is the only way to create a life that is worth value, to be able to talk about critical theory, to be able to talk about all of these different issues, but without any sort of foundational principles of what these very clear objectives should be for human life. That's why we're sending more and more people. We're funneling them through the system because we've secularized our idea beyond, I think, we sort of like lose track of how endemic this is and how essential this is to understanding every single problem that we face, whether it is foreign policy, whether it's academia, whether it's deaths of despair. It comes down to this so many times, and it's the same muddle that informs our foreign policy, because if you don't understand what you need to export and what you want to export and what it means to be a nation and what it means to be a country, then you're going to have a disastrous that's how you end up with forever wars, because your objectives become so unclear. And it's hard to see how you sort of come back from this, but I guess the best argument is that it's become so glaring that the first step is admitting you have a problem, and I think we're getting closer and closer to that at the very least.
So I think that's extremely well said by Emily. So I honestly don't have a ton to add to that. I'll just make kind of two quick points. I think what's making our crisis of meritocracy, we can say that, even worse, of course, because everything that Inez said is totally correct. This kind of notion that college credentials are kind of like it's a racket, it's a cartel, it's one form of domestic protectionism. But what kind of exacerbates it as well, something that we've discussed on numerous previous podcasts, of course, which is, it's kind of the CRT Ibram X Kendiization of perverting meritocracy, right? We've seen this kind of the Biden administration, where grants from the national scientific boards and research, the grants are increasingly being doled out not on the basis of actual underlying merits, but on the basis of kind of intersectional credentials and all that. Heather McDonald has written about this prolifically at City Journal and other outlets. So that's kind of only making our crisis of meritocracy even worse, of course. It's kind of when you kind of throw the CRT stuff into the mix as well. But I kind of wanted to briefly circle back to what Emily was talking about here, which it was really well said. This notion that we've kind of forgotten what it is, what the good life is here. But the slightly separate point that I want to make here is that while it is deeply, deeply important for Americans to kind of recover a sense of what the good life is, that I think a lot of us talk about this in podcasts a lot, recovering kind of these kind of traditional, American notions of justice, human flourishing, the common good, and so forth here. But the key point vis-a-vis Afghanistan, these nation-building boondoggles here, is that Americans' own conception of the good life applies to Americans. It does not necessarily apply to, third world Sharia backwaters halfway around the world here. John Quincy Adams, of course, had a very famous quote where he said, quote, "America is the well-wisher to the freedom and independence of all, but, quote, the champion and vindicator only of her own." So I think that's very important to bear in mind here. We need to recover a conception of the good life for sure, but let's then apply that domestically and not have the hubris to try to force it onto foreign cultures that are completely unlike our own whatsoever, because not only does that not do that culture any good, but as we've now seen in Iraq, Afghanistan, elsewhere, we will ultimately get humiliated, and it only then undermines our national interest and our deterrence posture vis-a-vis our true strategic threats, the Chinese Communist parties of the world, and so forth.
So to try to tie together some disparate themes here and to build on John Quincy Adams, and then also George Washington, obviously, in his farewell address, talking about avoiding foreign entanglements and beyond as well. Also worth reading that in full for his words on national security and foreign policy. I've gone down the Jeane Kirkpatrick rabbit hole, and obviously Dictatorships and Double Standards is probably her most famous essay, but she also wrote a piece in 1990 for the National Interest, which was titled "A Normal Country in a Normal Time." And it's amazing reading the words of that essay. They jump off the page and are equally relevant today. And so I want to kind of cede my time to just a couple excerpts from that essay that I think tie a nice bow on this episode. So she writes in part, "In the long years of World War II and the Cold War, the United States developed a foreign policy elite based in the bureaucracy, academic institutions, and heavily associated with nonprofit institutions. Members of this foreign policy elite grew accustomed to thinking of the United States as having boundless resources and purposes which transcended the preferences of voters and apparent American interests, expansive, expensive, global purposes, and eventually developed a disinterested globalist attitude which became identified with the liberal position in foreign policy. In American discussions of foreign policy, internationalism is often identified with this disinterested globalism, and opposition to it is thought of as isolationism." She puts these words in quotes. But disinterested globalism is only one American variant of internationalism, rarely practiced by other governments, most of which practice another variety of internationalism. As for isolationism, most Americans know it is not a viable alternative in the contemporary world. The isolationism versus internationalism debate is in reality the debate among the various types of internationalism. that which aims, frankly, to serve the national interest as conventionally conceived, to protect its territory, wealth, and access to necessary goods, to defend its nationals, that which aims to preserve and defend democracy, and a brand of disinterested globalism, which looks at the world and asks what needs to be done with little explicit concern for the national interest. And I think she frames it perfectly there. Now, what is ultimately our purpose? Kirkpatrick early on in her piece says this: a good society is defined not by its foreign policy, but by its internal qualities, by the existence of democracy, opportunity, fairness, by the relations among its citizens, the kind of character nurtured, and the quality of life lived. Foreign policy becomes a major aspect of society only if its government is expansionist, imperial, aggressive, or when it is threatened by aggression. One of the most important consequences of the half century of war and Cold War has been to give foreign affairs an unnatural importance. The end of the Cold War frees time, attention, and resources for American needs. America's chief collective purpose should be to make a good society better, more productive, more cohesive, more caring, more safe, more challenging, more serious. I think that we try to heed those sorts of views in every one of these episodes. And it would be fascinating to see what Kirkpatrick would say about a normal country in an abnormal time today, when you mix in the threat of China's Communist Party, which I think she does speak to in this essay. If you go through it in detail, she anticipates to some extent. And then also, of course, with all we're doing at home to hollow out the good society that we ought to be seeking. So on that note, we all should try to heed the words of Jeane Kirkpatrick. And I think it ties together these seemingly disparate threads nicely.
Well, on behalf of Josh, Ben, Inez, and I think Jeane Kirkpatrick, thanks for tuning in. I'm Emily Jashinsky, and we will see you at the next NatCon Squad.